President Donald Trump says tariffs in Canada and Mexico could go up in the future. A 25% tariff on some goods from both countries is set.
For decades, the United States shaped global trade on its own terms. Then came Donald Trump, who saw China and essentially any other rising power as the biggest economic threat. His solution? An all-out trade war. Massive tariffs, stricter policies, and a push to make American manufacturing great again. But something unexpected happened. The United States didn't gain control. It started losing it. Now Trump is back, and the world has changed. China has adapted. New superpowers are here, and the global economy is shifting faster than ever. So where does that leave America? And more importantly, where does that leave you? But first, how did we get here? Trump's initial gamble, the birth of the trade war. Donald Trump came into power with a clear message: America first. He vowed to revive struggling industries, bring back outsourced jobs, and end unfair trade deals, with China as his primary target. The United States had long maintained a trade deficit with China, and Trump saw this as a threat to national sovereignty. His administration moved quickly, imposing sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods by his second year in office. The goal was simple: make imports more expensive so American companies would manufacture at home. It was framed as a way to punish China while protecting American workers. But what seemed like a straightforward solution quickly backfired. Tariffs raised costs for American businesses that relied on Chinese materials. Manufacturers had two options: absorb the costs or pass them on to consumers. Most did the latter, and prices surged. From cars to household goods, everything became more expensive, straining American wallets before any benefits of the trade war could emerge. Despite these warning signs, Trump remained firm, promising that short-term sacrifices would lead to long-term economic dominance. He assured the public that manufacturing jobs would return, supply chains would rebuild, and America would regain its economic edge. But the reality proved far less optimistic. Now, with Trump back in office, the effects of this gamble are undeniable. The trade war did not revitalize American manufacturing. It exposed deeper weaknesses. The policies of his first term have set the stage for an even greater challenge in his second. What started as a battle of tariffs has become a full-scale economic shift, with the United States struggling to regain its footing. So let's talk about all the unintended economic side effects. Tariff fallout. When you think of tariffs, you might picture a war against China. But the real casualty? The United States economy. What started as an effort to make Chinese goods more expensive ended up making everyday life more costly for Americans. Tariffs didn't just target foreign manufacturers. They hit domestic businesses, supply chains, and consumers alike. The initial shock came in the form of rising prices. When American companies had to pay more for imported materials, they had no choice but to adjust their pricing. The cost of steel, aluminum, and electronics soared. Construction companies saw the price of raw materials spike. Automakers faced supply shortages. Retailers struggled to keep up with higher costs, passing them on to consumers. Suddenly, the average American was paying more for basic necessities, from household appliances to cars. For small businesses, the trade war was an even greater burden. Many smaller manufacturers relied on Chinese components to stay competitive. Unlike major corporations, they didn't have the flexibility to relocate production or negotiate better deals. Instead, they faced an impossible choice: raise prices and lose customers, or absorb costs and risk going under. Thousands of businesses struggled, and some simply could not survive. The result? Factory closures, layoffs, and economic uncertainty. But the impact didn't stop there. Supply chains, already fragile, were thrown into chaos. Shipping delays became common. Companies that relied on just-in-time manufacturing found themselves waiting weeks or even months for essential components. Industries that depended on global trade were forced to rethink their entire approach. Some tried to shift sourcing to other countries, but that came with new logistical challenges and costs. The damage was already done. Despite these clear economic strains, Trump framed the trade war as a necessary sacrifice. His administration argued that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain. But by the time he left office after his first term, the trade war had not delivered the promised resurgence in American manufacturing. Instead, it had exposed deep vulnerabilities. Now, as he steps into his second term, his administration faces the challenge of navigating an economic landscape still shaped by the very policies he put in place years earlier. But while the United States tightened its grip, China unleashed a counter-strategy that left Washington scrambling. China's immediate countermove, outsmarting U.S. policies. From the very beginning, China understood that tariffs alone could not cripple its economy. Instead of folding under economic pressure, it moved quickly, using a combination of financial tactics, trade agreements, and strategic partnerships to lessen the impact. One of China's first moves was shifting exports to new markets. As tariffs made it more expensive to sell to the United States, China increased trade with Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. It secured massive deals with emerging economies, ensuring that its manufacturing sector continued to thrive, even as its exports to the United States declined. China's ability to pivot so efficiently caught American policymakers off guard. At the same time, China used its state-backed industries to absorb some of the economic strain. Government subsidies allowed key industries to continue producing at competitive prices, despite the tariffs. Chinese tech companies, steel producers, and manufacturers received direct financial support to weather the trade war. This meant that while American businesses were struggling with rising costs, many Chinese firms were shielded from the worst effects of the conflict. Currency manipulation played another role. By adjusting the value of its currency, China made its exports more attractive to foreign buyers, offsetting the impact of tariffs. This tactic helped stabilize its economy while weakening the very policies the United States had hoped would pressure Beijing into economic submission. Instead of being weakened by the trade war, China emerged stronger and more self-reliant. It used the conflict as motivation to accelerate its own industrial independence. It invested heavily in domestic semiconductor production, expanded electric vehicle manufacturing, and doubled down on artificial intelligence research. The trade war didn't break China, it forced it to become more competitive. It is all backfiring on Trump. His strategies are not working. And this is just the glimpse of the iceberg. It seems like Trump is losing the war, and this is not the only thing that is actually backfiring on the president. Trump's vision of bringing jobs home, paradoxically, ended up pushing American companies abroad. Let's talk about it. The corporate exodus, U.S. businesses on the move. While tariffs were meant to make domestic production more appealing, they instead made it more expensive to operate in the United States. Businesses that had once relied on low-cost Chinese manufacturing now faced higher costs, but few viable alternatives. The first major shift was the relocation of production. Instead of moving factories back to the United States, companies moved them elsewhere, to Mexico, Vietnam, India, and other nations with lower labor costs. Automakers, tech giants, and retail supply chains all followed suit. The unintended consequence? A decrease in U.S. manufacturing jobs instead of an increase. Tech companies were particularly affected. Many relied on Chinese production for key components, and tariffs forced them to either absorb costs or seek alternative suppliers. Apple began diversifying its manufacturing, shifting production of some products to India. Tesla, which had invested in production facilities in China, continued to expand its presence overseas. Other companies followed the trend, seeking stability outside of the increasingly unpredictable U.S.-China trade landscape. Even traditional manufacturing giants found themselves caught in the storm. Automakers faced rising costs for steel and aluminum, leading some to adjust their production plans. While Trump envisioned a resurgence of Made in America products, the reality was far different. Many industries adapted not by returning home, but by leaving altogether. Now, as Trump navigates his second term, The challenge remains: how to bring back jobs that have already left. With supply chains firmly entrenched in new locations, reversing this trend is no simple task. The trade war that was meant to restore American economic power has instead reshaped global industry, and not in the way it was originally intended. So what's the new world order going to be like without America calling all the shots? Made in China 2025, the blueprint for a new era. While Trump was busy imposing tariffs, China was quietly rewriting the rules with a decades-long master plan. The world was watching as the United States attempted to tighten its grip on global trade, but China had already shifted its focus elsewhere, toward a future where it would no longer rely on American partnerships, supply chains, or technology. It was not a knee-jerk reaction to Trump's economic war. It was a long-term blueprint, carefully laid out and executed with precision. The plan, known as Made in China 2025, was not merely an industrial policy. It was a mission. China set out to dominate the industries of the future: semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and renewable energy. Unlike the reactive strategies in Washington, Beijing played the long game, investing heavily in research, education, and infrastructure. Government subsidies poured into high-tech industries, nurturing domestic giants capable of competing with and even surpassing their American counterparts. For decades, China depended on the United States and its allies for semiconductors and high-end chips. That changed when export restrictions were tightened. Instead of being crippled, China accelerated its self-reliance, funneling billions into chip manufacturing and supercomputing research. Within years, Chinese firms were producing their own advanced semiconductors, sidestepping Washington's attempt to throttle their growth. The same strategy was applied across industries. From biotechnology to electric vehicles, China's advancements continued at an unstoppable pace. The impact was undeniable. While the United States debated tariffs and trade wars, China was actively reshaping the balance of power. No longer just the world's factory, it was now a leader in innovation. The policies set forth in Made in China 2025 were not theoretical. They were transforming global markets at a breakneck speed. And speed is what matters the most right now, because one thing in particular, the technology race, the new face of competition. Imagine a race where every American advantage is neutralized by a rival's rapid innovation. That is the new reality. While Washington attempted to stifle China's tech sector, it inadvertently accelerated its rise. Nowhere is this more evident than in the electric vehicle market and artificial intelligence revolution. The United States once led the world in automotive manufacturing, but that leadership is now slipping. Companies like Tesla are no longer competing against legacy American automakers. They are struggling to keep up with China's electric vehicle giants. Firms like BYD and NIO have surged ahead, producing high-quality, cost-efficient vehicles at a scale the West cannot match. China now controls the production of lithium-ion batteries, a crucial component in electric vehicles, giving it a strategic advantage that Washington failed to foresee. Artificial intelligence tells a similar story. The United States imposed bans on Chinese tech firms, hoping to slow their progress in artificial intelligence, but it backfired. Denied access to American chips, China simply built its own. Denied access to Western artificial intelligence models, China developed alternatives. Chinese artificial intelligence firms are now rivaling and, in some cases, surpassing their American counterparts. The fear in Washington is no longer just about economic competition. It is about the national security risks of lagging behind in technology that shapes global influence. The expansion into fifth-generation wireless networks further cemented China's dominance. While the United States hesitated, China rapidly deployed infrastructure that positioned it as the world leader in telecommunications. The same trend is unfolding in quantum computing and robotics, where Chinese scientists are producing groundbreaking advancements. The unintended consequence of American export restrictions was that China no longer needed American technology. Instead, it built an ecosystem of innovation entirely on its own terms. What started as a defensive maneuver has evolved into a strategic offense, with China now setting the pace for global technological progress. The global trade takeover, China's new economic empire. While the United States remains mired in old policies, China is building a trade empire that spans continents. No longer content with simply producing goods for the West, China is now dictating the terms of global trade itself. The centerpiece of this transformation is the Belt and Road Initiative, a sweeping infrastructure project that connects China to Asia, Europe, and Africa through massive investments in ports, railways, and digital networks. China is deepening its economic ties with nations that previously depended on American-led trade agreements. The result is a shift in global influence. More countries are aligning their economies with China, making it increasingly difficult for the United States to isolate Beijing through sanctions or diplomatic pressure. China's influence is not limited to infrastructure. In Latin America, Chinese companies are buying up raw materials and expanding their hold on the energy sector. In Africa, China is financing the next generation of economic growth, supplying everything from telecommunications networks to electric grids. In Europe, China is forming strategic partnerships that undermine Washington's efforts to maintain dominance over Western alliances. This economic expansion is not just about trade, it is about rewriting the rules. The United States once controlled global financial institutions, but China is creating its own. The rise of the Chinese yuan as an alternative to the American dollar in international transactions further erodes the West's ability to dictate terms. Countries that once relied on American economic policies are now looking to Beijing as a primary trade partner. For Washington, the realization is grim. As global trade shifts, the United States finds itself increasingly isolated. The trade war that was meant to weaken China has, in reality, strengthened its economic empire. What was once an American-led order is being reshaped by Beijing's long-term strategy. This is the lasting damage in numbers: the United States economic crisis. The promise of economic revival remains elusive as America grapples with an unprecedented fiscal crisis. While China expands its global reach, the United States is confronting the consequences of trade policies that have failed to deliver on their promises. Inflation continues to eat away at American wages, making everyday life more expensive. The very tariffs that were meant to protect American industries have instead driven up costs for consumers. Supply chain disruptions persist, leaving companies struggling to maintain production at competitive prices. The job market remains unstable, with many industries unable to recover from the shocks of the past decade. The trade deficit, rather than shrinking, has only widened. Imports from China continue despite tariffs, and American exports struggle to find competitive footing in global markets. The imbalance grows larger, adding pressure to an economy already burdened by national debt and financial instability. Wall Street remains volatile, and while corporations find ways to adapt, the middle class bears the brunt of the impact. The harsh economic reality today is the direct result of policies set in motion years ago. The belief that tariffs alone could force China into submission has proven to be a miscalculation. Instead, the United States now faces an economy weakened by inflation, rising costs, and diminished global influence. With these mounting challenges, the question looms: how can Trump's current administration reverse this trend? The answer is far from clear, and as China continues its rapid ascent, the time for strategic adjustments is running out. The only thing clear right now is that this war will affect all of us. But how? The price of everyday life, skyrocketing costs. When you check your bank account, you might not realize it, but the trade war is costing you dearly. Every trip to the grocery store, every online purchase, and every gallon of fuel you pump into your car is more expensive than it should be. But why? The answer traces back to economic decisions made in Washington, where tariffs imposed on foreign goods have triggered a chain reaction. The cost of importing materials, from food ingredients to industrial parts, has risen dramatically. American businesses, unable to absorb these extra costs, pass them directly on to consumers. Take a simple loaf of bread. It requires wheat, which relies on fertilizer, which is often imported. When tariffs increase the cost of these essential materials, the price you pay at the checkout rises. The same principle applies to household staples like milk, eggs, and meat. Farmers, who once depended on affordable machinery and feed from international suppliers, now struggle with inflated expenses. Their solution? Raise prices, or worse, shut down their operations entirely. Electronics have been hit just as hard. The smartphone in your pocket, the laptop you work on, and even the television you watch have all become more expensive. The reason? The United States remains heavily dependent on China for electronic components. When tariffs targeted these imports, companies were left with two choices: pay more or shift production elsewhere. Some chose the latter, relocating manufacturing to countries like Vietnam or India. But this process takes time, and in the meantime, costs remain high. Consumers are left paying the difference. And then there's fuel. While oil production in the United States remains strong, refining and distribution rely on parts and chemicals that come from abroad. Higher import costs mean higher prices at the pump. A few cents per gallon may not seem like much at first, but over months and years, it takes a toll on household budgets. All of this contributes to inflation, which has slowly drained purchasing power. The average American now finds themselves earning the same paycheck while affording less. Meanwhile, savings shrink, debts grow, and financial stress increases. Some have been forced to take on second jobs. Others have cut back on non-essential purchases, avoiding restaurants, delaying home repairs, or canceling travel plans. But while consumers struggle, large corporations have found ways to adapt. They shift supply chains, negotiate bulk discounts, or relocate production to avoid higher costs. It is the smaller businesses, the backbone of American communities, that bear the brunt of these policies. The struggles of small businesses, a silent crisis. The trade war has been a death sentence for small businesses. Because unlike multinational companies that can restructure operations, local businesses are trapped, forced to navigate rising costs with no escape. Imagine a family-owned furniture shop that has been in business for generations. Their materials, wood, fabric, steel, are suddenly subject to higher import taxes. The cost of producing a single table jumps significantly, but raising prices too much risks losing customers. The owner is left with an impossible choice: absorb the losses or close their doors. Then there's the restaurant owner who depends on imported ingredients, the local mechanic whose repair parts have doubled in price, and the independent electronics store that struggles to compete with online giants who source directly from overseas. Across the country, small businesses are shutting down, unable to keep up with the financial strain. The consequences of these closures extend far beyond the owners themselves. Each business that disappears takes jobs with it. Employees are left searching for work in an already struggling economy. Families who once relied on these businesses for steady income now face financial uncertainty. Communities lose more than just stores. They lose gathering places, cultural staples, and a sense of local identity. The ripple effect continues. Fewer businesses mean less competition, allowing larger companies to dominate. With less competition, prices remain high. What started as a trade war to protect American industries has ended up hurting the very foundation of the economy. As this silent crisis unfolds, a deeper question emerges. How will the manufacturing sector, the heart of American industry, survive the pressures of an increasingly competitive global market? The United States versus the world, shifting global power. While the United States battles its own economic demons, the rest of the world is capitalizing on its decline. Countries that once played a supporting role in global trade are now stepping into the spotlight, reshaping the international economic landscape. The European Union, India, and Latin America are no longer passive participants in the trade war between the United States and China. Instead, they are forging new alliances, expanding their markets, and exploiting the gaps left by American economic policies. The European Union, often seen as a hesitant economic player, is now aggressively expanding its trade partnerships. With the United States retreating from global trade leadership, European nations have pushed for stronger trade agreements with both China and India, securing access to critical resources and technological advancements. European manufacturing hubs, particularly in Germany and France, are benefiting from redirected supply chains that once flowed through the United States. As American tariffs push businesses away, the European Union has positioned itself as a stable alternative. India, once a developing economy overshadowed by China, has emerged as a major contender in global trade. With a young and highly skilled workforce, India has successfully attracted businesses seeking alternatives to Chinese manufacturing. The country's strategic trade deals with nations in Southeast Asia and Africa have solidified its role as a key economic player. India's investment in technology, infrastructure, and digital finance has further strengthened its global standing. While the United States struggles to retain its influence, India has capitalized on every opportunity to expand its economic reach. Latin America, long reliant on the economic policies of the United States, has begun to pivot toward China and other global partners. Countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are deepening their ties with China, securing investment in energy, agriculture, and infrastructure. The shift away from dependence on the United States has allowed these nations to gain leverage in global trade discussions. As American influence weakens, Latin American economies are forging independent trade strategies, ensuring their own growth and stability. With these changes unfolding, the global economic order is experiencing a seismic shift. The traditional dominance of the United States in international trade is being replaced by a multipolar system where power is more evenly distributed. The rise of new economic superpowers. As the United States struggles to maintain its grip on global trade, new economic superpowers are stepping up. The global economy is no longer centered around a single dominant force, but is shifting toward a more balanced structure where multiple nations hold significant influence. China has already positioned itself as a major global player, with trade networks spanning every continent. Its Belt and Road Initiative has deepened ties with emerging economies, securing long-term partnerships. China's advancements in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and semiconductor manufacturing have further solidified its position as a leader in innovation. India, once seen as a technology outsourcing hub, is now competing directly with global giants. Its rapid expansion in digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicle production has propelled it to the forefront of economic growth. Strengthening trade relationships with both Western and Eastern markets, India is seizing opportunities left open by the United States' shifting trade policies. Meanwhile, the Middle East and Africa are emerging as key economic forces. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have expanded beyond oil, investing heavily in technology, finance, and logistics. African nations are leveraging their growing industrial and agricultural sectors to establish new trade partnerships that bypass traditional Western markets. The rise of these new economic leaders is reshaping the rules of trade. As their influence expands, the dominance of the United States continues to wane. The question is no longer whether the world is changing. It already has. The real challenge is whether the United States can adapt before it falls further behind. What do you think? Let's know in the comments. Thanks for watching.